So to introduce Sarah, Sarah trained as a critical care nurse before completing a Bachelor of Arts with honours and a PhD at the University of Melbourne. She is a public health researcher who became interested in aged care when her parents moved to an aged care home. And I think this next story is astounding. After her father died, she stopped full-time work so she could spend as much time with her mum as possible. She wanted her mum's quality of life to be as good as it could be. She wanted her mum to feel valued and be engaged in her twilight years. The time Sarah spent with her mum in the aged care home was precious for them both. Although Sarah enjoyed the 4 years she spent with residents and staff, she watched the comings and goings in the aged care home with a critical eye. She's been a principal researcher at Research Matters since 1999. Her work has focused on public health, mental health, ethics, and aged care. She began Aged Care Matters in 2016, and she's published 75 opinion pieces and numerous letters to the aged. And I imagine that's probably out of date by now because I read it on the website and it's a very ongoing process. So just to remember questions at the end, and we'll hand over to Sarah. Thank you, Sarah.
Oh, thank you, Erica, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. I also pay my respects to the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, their elders past, present and future. I extend my respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait people here on Zoom today. The resilience and wisdom of your culture is our nation's greatest treasure. I wish to acknowledge the respect your culture bestows on your elders. I also wish to acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Sorry, I've got a bit of a croak. The aged care sector is in crisis. Evidence to this statement is in the 8 volumes of the final report of the Royal Commission. So a year before the Royal Commission started, the federal government announced yet another aged care inquiry. And soon after this announcement, I bumped into the good old Greg Hunt, who was jogging on the Mount Martha boardwalk. I stopped him. I don't normally stop him, but I did on this occasion. And I asked, why do we need yet another inquiry? Surely the government was aware of the systemic problems in the aged care sector. I told him, and I'm very direct, I told him I thought our aged care system was a national disgrace. Greg disagreed, claiming Australia had a world-class aged care system. The Royal Commission, which was announced a year later, certainly proved me right and Minister Hunt wrong. This morning, I will describe what's wrong with the aged care system, but I don't want to focus on what's wrong. I'd prefer to focus on solutions about how to fix the aged care system. The first step, and the most important step, is to shift our ageist attitudes. It was never part of my life plan to be an aged care advocate. I stumbled into aged care advocacy after my parents moved into an aged care home. And with my background as a public health researcher and a registered nurse, as Erica mentioned, I saw the systemic issues in aged care and I began publishing my analysis of these issues in the media. I soon developed a reputation as an independent and informed aged care advocate. It was also not my life plan to stand as the Voices endorsed independent candidate for Flinders. However, when the Voices candidate pulled out and members of Voices voted to endorse a candidate, I put my hand up to replace the aged care minister in his seat of Flinders. By that stage, Greg Hunt was also the aged care minister. Now, I did this primarily to help Voices, but I was also motivated by the failure of successive governments, not just the Liberal governments, lots of governments over the last 20 years, to respond meaningfully to the crisis in aged care. My parents actually enjoyed living in the aged care home. Most staff treated them with kindness, respect, and love. Staff in aged care homes are often really hardworking, dedicated people, also in home care, but they're doing a really difficult job for not much pay or professional kudos. Now, my parents chose the aged care home primarily because they could sleep together in the same room. In fact, it was the only home we could find where they could sleep together. It's important to stress that they chose the aged care home themselves. Unlike many families who are forced to make the decision quickly after an older person has a health crisis, they might have a fall or a heart attack, my parents moved into the aged care home when they were both in reasonably good health. I noted with interest during the Royal Commission that Merle Mitchell, who some of you may remember, was the president of the Australian Council of Social Service, ACOS, and she was a resident in an aged care home, and she gave a testimony to the Royal Commission where she said her aged care home was not a home. In contrast, Mum and Dad called Victoria by the Park their home. This suggests there are huge variations in aged care homes, ranging from the dangerously bad, like the ones we hear about in the media, to the very good that we hear very little about in the media. My parents were lucky to choose a good aged care home. However, choosing a good aged care home should not rely on luck. So after Dad's death, and Eric has mentioned this, I began visiting Mum. I had a little routine where I would arrive each day around lunchtime, and I would sit at the dining table with Mum's friends. Mum, as a 90-year-old, didn't have very large appetite, so she was always given a full portion at lunchtime so that I could eat her leftovers. And the food was really excellent, certainly much better than I cook. In the afternoon, when Mum's great-grandchildren visited, we transformed the lounge room into romper room, which Mum and the other residents really enjoyed. We had our own old people's home for 4-year-olds. A year or so after visiting Mum, I became concerned that the media only reported horror stories about aged care. Surely Mum was not living in the only good aged care home in Australia. So as a researcher, I designed an open-ended questionnaire for family and friends, asking them to describe their experiences of the aged care home. 174 people from around Australia completed the questionnaire. However, and for me disappointingly, they mostly described their negative experiences, some that were quite shocking, similar to what we heard during the Royal Commission. I sent my report to Ken Wyatt, who at the time was the Minister for Aged Care. I encouraged him and his advisors to read it. It took a few months and numerous phone calls and emails to get him to actually read it. But as some of you may know, I'm very well known for my persistence. And when he and his advisor finally read the report, they told me it shocked them. I had to really, process this, because I realised that when a politician visits an aged care home, the manager puts on a lovely afternoon tea, employs extra staff, and introduces them only to the happy residents and families. Soon after Ken read my report, I received a phone call asking whether I could do similar research for home care. Ken recognised that I am truly independent. Unlike the agencies that we know about, COTA and National Seniors, etc., I do not receive any money or any government money. My aged care advocacy is all voluntary. So I can speak with frank and fearlessly. I don't need to worry about where the next check's coming from. Ken told me he wanted to know older people's experiences of in-home care, from those who receive home care packages and also the Commonwealth Home Support Program. I'm not going to speak much about this, but I do wish the Mornington Peninsula Shire Council had read this report before they made their decision to transition council's home care to private providers. My consumer research, they call old people consumers, but anyway, my consumer research on residential and home care should contribute to evidence-based policy. However, there are some important barriers. Aged care policy is primarily determined by providers of aged care, bureaucrats, and politicians, not older people, families, and staff. Before I start talking about my solutions or my suggested solutions, it's important to talk briefly about the Royal Commission. Scott Morrison's announcement of the Royal Commission into Aged Care surprised everyone, including the Aged Care Minister, Ken Wyatt, who only the week earlier had told me we don't need a Royal Commission. He said, we have all the evidence we need. And I responded, we just need the political will to act. The announcement of the Royal Commission came on the eve of the ABC Four Corners special investigation into the failings in aged care, which I contributed to. But when the Royal Commission was announced, I argued in The Guardian that government by media had replaced careful consideration of the evidence. I believe the Royal Commission into Aged Care, like the Royal Commission into Banking, was a strategy for the previous government to continue to kick the can down the road. Before jumping into yet another expensive Royal Commission, it would have been prudent for the government, or the previous government, to review the numerous inquiries that both the Liberal National Party and the ALP governments had initiated over the past 2 decades. Surely the government didn't need Four Corners to inform them that the aged care sector is in crisis. There have been so many inquiries, reviews, consultations, think tanks and task forces that have provided mounds of evidence of inadequate personal care, negligence, neglect, abuse and assault. These inquiries have resulted in a large number of really good recommendations, most of which have been ignored by successive governments. I predicted the findings of the Royal Commission would be similarly ignored, and I have been proved correct, though my fingers are crossed with our new federal government. Ken Wyatt invited me to assist with the terms of reference of the Royal Commission, but in the end, the major failing of the Royal Commission was the 2 Royal Commissioners disagreed. People think I'm joking when I say Linnell Briggs and Tony Pagoni should have had counselling to sort out their differences before making their recommendations. Their disagreements resulted in the Royal Commission's recommendations being something just happened. Okay. Not just improving staff numbers, but we actually have to also improve their training. Caring for older people with complex health issues is a demanding job that requires specific expertise. TAFE offers reputable 12-month courses. However, there are also fast-track courses, some as short as 6 weeks. These short courses do not equip graduates to work competently with older people. My next suggestion is the registration of personal care attendants. Now, as many of you would know, there is oversight of most healthcare professionals. Registered enrolled nurses, psychologists, social workers, etc., must all be registered with respective professional bodies. But personal care attendants are not registered with any professional body. To work in an aged care home or in a home care, personal care attendants, support workers, require only a police check. Currently, when a personal care attendants are sacked for poor standards of care or some other issue, they simply get another job in a different aged care home or with a different home care provider. I witnessed this in Mum's aged care home when standards of care declined after a new manager started. Standards of care in an aged care home often depend on the manager. And when this new manager came in, standards of care dropped. But there was also complaints about 2 personal care attendants who were allegedly robbing residents, people with dementia get robbed all the time because people say they don't remember, but there was also allegations that they were abusing residents and they were accused of negligence. It was a difficult situation because we didn't know what to do. So we called a meeting of residents' families and we all shared our complaints. Now, this process was really important because when you share complaints, before that, everyone thinks their problem is just their own problem, a one-off. But the meeting we had highlighted the fact that there was a serious problem in this aged care home since this new manager had started. So what did we do? Some people wanted to go straight to the media, but I did not see how this would resolve our problem. I suggested in the first instance, families documented their grievances. Remember, I'm a researcher. So I then wrote a 60-page report, which I gave to the owner. And the first thing he did was to apologise. And I could tell it was a genuine apology. I mean, to his credit, he responded quickly. The manager was retired, or a euphemism for sacked, and the 2 personal care attendants did not work in the aged care home again. But my concern is they went to work in another aged care home, which they did. So I'm really glad that one of the recommendations of the Royal Commissioners is to introduce a system of registration for personal care attendants. So it'll be similar to other healthcare professionals. I advocated for this recommendation to be introduced immediately. However, the previous government did nothing. Thankfully, our new federal government has promised that personal care attendants will be registered. We now need the slow wheels of bureaucracy to move. The next couple of recommendations aren't commonly talked about, but they're really important, and that is disclosing performance indicators. I've tried for 6 years to get data on adverse incidents in aged care homes, such as the incidence of pressure injuries, dehydration, malnutrition, medication errors, and falls. This information is needed not only for researchers such as myself to have an evidence-based discussion about standards of care, but they're also important to help people make informed decisions when choosing an aged care home. Let's say a family is looking for an aged care home. After reading several glossy brochures, they choose one. 6 months later, their loved one receives the wrong medication and is rushed to hospital. They then find out that there have been several medications in that aged care home over the past year. If they had had that information before they chose the aged care home, they would most likely not have chosen it. In a similar vein, I have argued till I'm blue in the face that the public could have access to all the regulators' reports. They do regular reports on aged care homes and home care providers. Now, I once asked Ken Wyatt to give us, why can't we have this information? So he took my idea to the aged care sector committee, and Channel 9 did a freedom of information and found the minutes from this meeting, and just really blew my head off that the idea was voted against because the CEO of COTA, which is allegedly a consumer organisation, claimed patronisingly that the information in these reports from the regulator would be too technical for the public. What do I say? But it's not just the reports the regulator does on the aged care homes and the home care providers. We also need access to the complaints that are made. We also need to know how these complaints are managed, because reporting of complaints is part of my push for transparency. Although complaints are inevitable, it is important to know how these complaints are resolved. Unfortunately, once again, the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission simply refuses to share this information. And the question I have been asking for 6 years is, who decided that information on the safety and well-being of residents and recipients of home care must be kept top secret? I think I have time to give a quick example of this. It happened during the pandemic. During the second lockdown, the government historically has been far more concerned about protecting aged care providers. Some of these aged care providers are multinationals and large superannuation funds. They're much more interested in protecting them than the interests of those living in residential aged care and receiving home care. And the best example and most recent example of this was during our second lockdown in Victoria. Richard Colbeck, who was then the Minister for Aged Care, said he would not publicly name the aged care homes with outbreaks of COVID. This was during the beginning of that lockdown. He said he was worried about providers' reputational damage. So what did I do? Yes, I'm a pain in the neck to these poor old governments and bureaucrats, but I asked my Aged Care Matters Facebook group to name these aged care homes with outbreaks. I then published the list of 124 aged care homes. And it's the only time in my history of being a tweeter that a tweet of mine has gone viral. And soon after this, the Department of Health published the names, as they should, in a weekly report, and they continue to do so. I've got about a few more minutes to go, but I'm just going to talk about banning the use of antipsychotic drugs. These should not be used unless they're prescribed by a psychiatrist. I mean, alarm bells should have gone up when we had the first national audit of psychiatric medicine in aged care homes. They found two-thirds of all residents were prescribed psychotropic agents regularly. I mean, this is chemical restraint. And it's not a new problem, like everything in aged care. Nothing seems to be new. In the past 20 years, there have been several government inquiries, surprise, surprise, into the over-reliance on medication to manage the behaviour of residents. These inquiries all recommend educating staff to adopt alternative ways of managing behavioural problems. Don't just bomb them out with medication. Learn strategies, distraction, all sorts of things can be used. But the elephant in the room that we don't talk about enough is the doctors who prescribe this medication. They're often prescribed by a GP. There is strong evidence that many psychiatric drugs are not only ineffective, but they may cause older people substantial harm, including falls, pneumonia, and sometimes premature death. So why are doctors prescribing these drugs? And that's a rhetorical question, because we know why they're being prescribed. They're being prescribed because there is not enough suitably trained staff employed to manage residents or to work with residents, distract them, do activities. There are lots of ways to, rather than just giving them a medicine that makes them drowsy in front of the television. I've also argued for a long time, probably 10 years, for the mandatory reporting of elder abuse. Now, my beginning advocacy was a personal experience with financial elder abuse, and I found out that it is the most common form of elder abuse. Research has identified adult children, particularly sons, it's another gendered activity, they're the most common perpetrators of financial abuse, and the victims are most often women over the age of 80. So back 10 years ago, I worked very hard to ensure red flags for financial elder abuse. So nowadays, a bank is required to report when a financial power of attorney makes a large withdrawal from an older person's account. I didn't realise 10 years ago, but it is certainly worth thinking about, most research in elder abuse has been undertaken in the community, not aged care homes. So in more recent years, my attention has turned towards elder abuse in aged care homes, where the most common form of abuse is not financial, it's actually physical and sexual. So I lobbied for a serious incident response scheme, which we now have, though their reporting, like everything else from the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission, their reporting has been hopeless. The last few recommendations are about home care, and I've got 5 minutes to talk about home care, but we know that most older people want to stay at home as they age. In the old days, before my aged care, Victoria had one of the best home care systems via home and community care. Local councils employed highly trained, caring and competent staff to provide an invaluable service to older people in our community. In 2013, the Gillard ALP government introduced the Living Longer, Living Better aged care reforms. These reforms were motivated by forecasts of a burgeoning ageing population and concerns, and these were quite legitimate concerns, about how the government could afford to provide services for older people in years to come. These bipartisan reforms encouraged private home care, aged care providers to enter what the government bureaucrats call the aged care marketplace. Soon after these reforms were legislated, the Liberal and National Party won the federal election, and they have forged ahead with gusto to implement the neoliberal reforms. The coalition government was determined to turn the provision of home care services into a competitive market, turning older people into economic participants. Some councils have rejected transitioning their long-standing and long-trusted services to market-based systems. These councils appreciated how important their services are to older people in their communities. My research shows that council aged care workers are valued and sometimes loved by their clients. Older residents and their families appreciate having a highly trained and fairly remunerated council employee provide aged care services. They can also be assured they are not being ripped off by a private provider that prioritises profits over care. The most common complaint about corporate home care providers is the high turnover of unqualified, inexperienced, untrained, and poorly paid support workers. A high turnover of staff is a recipe for disaster. It results in strangers being sent to work in older people's homes, and older people simply have to trust that they will be treated with respect and kindness. The Health Department has been talking about combining home care packages and the Commonwealth Home Support Program since 2018. The new program, to be called the Home Support Program, was due to start next year. However, the Albanese government has delayed the start until 2024. In announcing the delay, Anika Wells, the aged care minister, said the government was, I'm quoting, taking the time to address the concerns instead of rushing to failure. As a result, several councils have delayed their decisions about whether to remain a home care provider. The best way to ensure older people get the residential and home care services they deserve is for governments to work with older people and families when designing aged care services. The new buzzword is co-design. However, like many bureaucratic buzzwords, the word has been adopted, but not the practice. I've attended several co-design workshops with KPMG that have been tokenistic consultations. Again, let's hope the new Labor government does it better. My final suggestion, which I'll say very quickly, is actually due to, relates to the pandemic, when many aged care providers detained residents in aged care homes. I mean, the past 2 years of COVID has been a heartbreaking time for many residents in aged care homes and their families. When the pandemic took off in March 2020, all non-essential staff were banned from entering aged care homes. This included family members who regularly cared for their loved ones by helping with feeding, toileting, social support, and so on. I would have been banned from going to visit my mother, for example. Providers claimed a total lockdown was necessary to save lives. However, families who contacted me, hundreds of families who were locked out, they were far more afraid that their loved one would die of neglect, not COVID. So just as a final sentence or two, if the current Labor government genuinely wants to reform the aged care system, the Minister for Aged Care needs to engage with recipients of aged care services, both residential and home care, with families and with staff. Many years ago, I gave similar advice to the Department of Health. So they organised a consumer roundtable with Ken Wyatt when he was the Minister for Aged Care. I was invited together with many CEOs of consumer organisations. After the introductions, I realised there was not one genuine consumer at the table. So I said to Ken Wyatt, publicly to all of them, who was also the Minister for Indigenous Affairs, can you imagine convening a meeting to discuss Indigenous affairs without one First Nations person at the table? Unlike many of the CEOs, Ken understood my message. So my message to the federal government and the department, which is now called the Department of Health and aged care, thanks to Linnell Briggs' tinkering. So my suggestion is to quote Einstein: "We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
Something just happened. Okay.